My my name is Stephanie Reese-Fender, and I'm a housing specialist with HCD's Homekey Plus program. In collaboration with the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, also known as BCSH, we are presenting this training as part of Cal ICH's mission to develop policies and identify resources, benefits, and services that help prevent and ultimately end homelessness across California. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Homekey Plus website. During today's session, all attendees will remain muted and the chat feature will be disabled. If you have questions related to the HMIS process, please use the Q&A button so your question will be sent directly to our panel. We will do our best to answer all questions today, time permitting. However, we do plan to complete all submitted questions and compile all submitted questions into an FAQ, which will be shared with you afterwards. Please note that today's presentation focuses specifically on HMIS requirements and processes. For questions regarding the Homekey Plus program, such as the NOFA application or eligible projects, please email us at projecthomekey@hcd.ca.gov. I will post this email address along with the direct link to the Homekey Plus website in the chat for your reference. Thank you all for joining us today and for the critical work you do to address homelessness in your communities. At this time, I'd like to introduce Emery Reifsnyder from the BCSH team. Emery?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Homekey Plus grantees training for HMIS and an introduction to AB 977. Stephanie, I just had a bunch of windows open on my end. Is the screen share still looks good?
Yes, it does.
Great. Okay. So hi everyone, my name is Emery Reif-Snyder. I'm a research data supervisor over at Cal ICH on the research and data team. And I'll pass it to Sydney Bennett, who, to give a quick introduction for herself, will be the two presenters for today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sydney Bennett. I'm the Director of Research at Cal ICH, and our team is the ones who support our collaborating state departments on AB 977 implementation. And I will pass it back to Mer.
All right, let's get into it. So today we're going to be talking about Assembly Bill 977 or AB 977, why it matters, what it means for you, and how to be in compliance with its requirements. So like Stephanie said, I want to note at the top, this is going to be a lot of information, but please don't worry about absorbing everything immediately because it is going to be recorded for your reference. I also will say there's going to be a lot of slides. We're going to take a 5-minute break halfway through, and that should help to break things up a little bit. So here's our agenda for today. We'll be starting with an overview of some basic concepts and AB 977 and doing some definitions. Then we'll be moving on to discuss key partners in AB 977 implementation, as well as relationships and roles between them. After that, we'll be getting into details of the data entry requirements of AB 977, starting with an overview of project setup, and then getting into details of entering client data. After that, we'll discuss some next steps, and we'll have a slide with a list of resources for your reference, and these slides will be distributed after this training. Please ask questions as they arise using the chat feature. We will have some time at the end to answer questions, and it might not make sense for us to answer questions, or we might prefer to just provide written answers to certain questions. So anything that we don't address in this training, we will address in a follow-up as a FAQ document. A quick intro to Cal ICH, like Sydney mentioned, we work at the Interagency Council on Homelessness, Cal ICH, and Cal ICH is a convener, facilitator, and leader for homelessness policy across the state government and between the state and local jurisdictions. So we work on the research and data team, where part of our role is to help implement legislation related to homelessness data collection, such as AB 977. Okay, and now we can get started by defining what AB 977 is. So Assembly Bill 977, or AB 977, as I'm going to say from now on, requires grantees of certain state homelessness programs to enter data into their local homeless management information systems, or HMIS. So an HMIS is a local information system, kind of like a database, used to collect data on housing and services provided to people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, and includes information on people served, projects that provide services to folks, funding sources, and more. AB 977 matters because it helps us understand the homelessness services that the state is funding so we can better understand the services that are being provided, track program outcomes, and make data-driven policy decisions. I don't believe that these exclusions should be relevant to anyone in the Homekey Plus grantee cohort. But if you think that these might be relevant to you, please reach out to us and we can discuss. So there are a couple of exclusions for AB 977 requirements, which are tribal grantees and victim service providers, or VSPs. And VSPs are organizations that primarily provide services to victims of domestic violence. So now I will pass it over to Sydney, who is going to talk a bit about roles and relationships in AB 977 implementation.
Thank you, Emery. AB 977 requires coordination across several state and local partners within California's homelessness response system. And so we'll be talking through each key partner here today and their roles in AB 977. This chart here shows an overview of the 4 different entities we're talking about today, and then we'll go into each in a bit more detail. You'll see we have us, Cal ICH, where we work very closely with HCD to develop guidance, TA materials, and on data collection. HCD, for this program for Homekey Plus, they're the funding administrator, and so they're the ones who are providing guidance and monitoring AB 977 compliance. And so together, that is the state side. And then there are also the continuums of care and their HMIS leads, which we'll talk about a bit more, but they are the ones who run the HMIS data systems and will help with setting up projects and managing local HMIS systems. And then you all, of course, are the Homekey Plus grantees, or maybe some sub-grantees and service providers here as well. And so we'll talk more about your role, which is really focused on data entry. The arrows here show the lines of communication. So as grantees, you will generally be working with either HCD or your COC HMIS leads, depending on what kind of questions or what you need support with. And then Cal ICH works directly with HCD and with the COC HMIS leads. So generally you wouldn't correspond directly with Cal ICH, this webinar being kind of an exception and one of the ways that we're supporting HCD with this process. And so we can go into each in more details. So you all, the grantees, that is the entity that holds the contract with HCD to receive the Homekey Plus funding. The main responsibility for grantees is entering data into HMIS in adherence with the AB 977 guidance that has been provided in advance of this training by HCD, and then that's also what we're walking through here today. Grantees may delegate data entry, so especially for projects like the Homekey Plus ones, it may be a sub-grantee, a contracted service provider who's actually the ones entering data, and that's fine. Usually you'd want the person who's directly engaging with Homekey Plus clients or residents to be doing that data entry. The grantee still remains responsible for compliance, so making sure whoever you delegated that responsibility to is following through is still the grantee's requirement, and HCD will still correspond information to grantees, and it would be on you to communicate that to any entity you've delegated data entry to. And that will just be kind of a project specific requirement. Great. The next entity we'll talk about today is COCs and HMIS leads. For those who are unfamiliar with what a continuum of care is, they are a regional or local planning body that coordinates housing and services for individuals and families experiencing homelessness. Hopefully, many of you are already connected with your COC in different ways. Geographically, most COCs are the equivalent of a county. In California, there are some multi-county COCs, so where 2 or more counties are part of the same COC. And then the one area where there are sub-county COCs is in Los Angeles. So there are 3 cities within LA County that are their own COC, and then the rest of the county is a COC. So if your project was located in those cities, then that would be relevant to you in terms of who you're working with. The COCs designate the HMIS lead entity, which is the entity or organization responsible for managing the HMIS or Homeless Management Information System, the data collected, the policies around that. And the HMIS leads are the ones who submit the AB 977 data to the state. So you all would be responsible, or whoever you designate, for entering that client data into HMIS. Once it's in HMIS, that is where the responsibility would end on the grantee side. The HMIS leads do the submission to the state, to Cal ICH, and then Cal ICH provides that data to HCD. The grantees, you all will need to work with your HMIS lead to get the user license to access HMIS, to set up your project, and all of those kinds of things. We recommend reaching out at least 90 days before you intend to begin serving clients, as this will ensure that you have time to get set up, attend any required trainings, and so forth. HCD sent out before this training, and we'll send it out again as well, the contact list for HMIS leads that Cal ICH maintains. So that should provide you with the proper person to reach out to based on where your project is located. And then the last roles are the state side. So HCD and Cal ICH. HCD for Homekey Plus is the administering department of the funding. They will be the ones communicating data entry requirements, providing any guidance materials. They'll be the ones communicating with you all and monitoring data entry and program compliance. And then Cal ICH will be working with HCD on specifying that format of data entry, developing any materials, receiving that HMIS data, as I mentioned, from COCs, and providing any needed technical assistance. And then we will start talking through some of the details of data entry into HMIS. And first, we'll be talking about the fields that focus at the project level. So these are fields that are just completed once per project when you're setting up your project. And then later we'll get into the client fields. On to the next slide. So once you're connected with your HMIS lead, the first step will be setting up the project and project level information. You would also receive some kind of HMIS training before data entry begins that would help your users understand the data entry requirements and any COC specific requirements. We also have provided in the setup instructions some of the information your HMIS lead is going to ask for so that you can prepare that ahead of your initial conversation. Some COCs may have their own templates, but if they don't, the HCD provided template includes information such as the name of the project, the name of the organization operating the project, the type of project, so that you can pre-fill that out before you have those initial conversations. And so now we'll talk through a couple of the key data elements around project setup. So the first is knowing what an HMIS project is. That's a distinct unit of organization that provides services as set up in HMIS. And then the project type. So there can only be one project type associated with each HMIS project. For Homekey Plus, we expect all the projects would be permanent supportive housing. So you'd be setting up an HMIS project with the project type of PSH or permanent supportive housing. And then another key element, which we'll go into detail about how to fill this out, is the other funder codes and grant identifiers or grant IDs. These are the codes that the administering department, so HCD in this case, has provided to identify each unique funding recipient. Emery will be talking about kind of where this gets entered, but this is the way the state would confirm that you are adhering to data entry requirements. And so please make sure that this is communicated to your HMIS lead. Otherwise, you might be entering data in HMIS, but the state isn't knowing that it's this Homekey Plus project. And so, you might get an outreach from HCD that says your data is missing because we can't see that without these fields. Projects can have more than one funding program or grant ID tied to them, and we'll have some examples of that. Or a single grant could have multiple projects. And so the project setup is complete once all of those project level data elements, which you'll sometimes hear referred to as project descriptor data elements or PDDEs, are entered for the project. Today, we'll go into a little bit more detail on 3 key PDDE categories: the project information, the funding sources, and the bed and unit inventory. And I will pass it back to Emery to walk through each of those.
Thank you, Sydney. Okay, so we'll start with the project information data elements. So these data elements are used to describe and identify each project in HMIS. Project information data elements include some that we've already touched on, like project name and project type, as well as other important fields like operating start and end date of the project and the continuum project field. Oops. The operating start and end dates denote the dates during which a project was actively providing services, with the start date equaling the day that clients began to be served in the project, and the operating end date meaning the last day that the project provided services. While the project is active, the operating end date can be left blank, or if there's some reason that you know the date in the future that a project will cease in providing services, that can be added ahead of time. So we'll have a couple of visualizations like this. This is a visual that shows how operating start and end dates work. You can see on the top is a project that is still serving clients, or what we would call an active project. So it has a blank operating end date. On the bottom is a closed project, meaning that it has a operating end date entered here. So the way that we would interpret the information here, both of these projects have an operating start date on January 1st, 2024, meaning they both started serving clients on January 1st. The project on the bottom, the closed project, served clients for 6 months until June 1st, 2024. And that was the day that the last client was exited from the project, or the date that they ended service. And the project on the top is still active and still serving folks, so that end date is blank. Moving on to the continuum project and project type fields. So these will both always be the same for Homekey Plus projects. For the continuum project data element, which is a yes or no question that determines whether the project is primarily serving people experiencing homelessness, the answer should always be yes. Like Sydney mentioned before, for project type, because the Homekey Plus NOFA is exclusively funding permanent supportive housing, we're expecting that all Homekey Plus project types should be permanent supportive housing or PSH. So if you are directly doing that project setup, which will vary by implementation, that will be a selectable option out of the list. So here is the first of a couple of examples that we'll talk through. And in this example, we're going to be talking about what a project type conversion will look like in HMIS. So we understand that some projects will be conversions of one service type or another to permanent supportive housing or PSH. So this is how that should look like set up in HMIS. So in this example, a grantee is operating a transitional housing project or TH and is using the Homekey Plus funding to convert those TH units into permanent supportive housing units. So since projects only reflect one single type of service, the TH and PSH activities will be entered into HMIS as two separate projects, one representing the TH services and one the PSH. So once all service has ended in the original transitional housing project, the project should be closed by adding an operating end date. Closing the project also requires that all clients be exited by having a project exit date added and that the funding source be closed by adding a grant end date, but we'll talk about both of those in further detail later. Here is a diagram that visualizes this example. So we can see the original project on the left in orange has an operating end date on the last day that clients were served in that project. And the new PSH project here with the Homekey Plus grant has an operating start date on the first day that it began to receive services, or excuse me, began to serve clients. And since this is an active project, the operating end date has been left blank. So hopefully that is relatively clear. We will continue to talk about and kind of build on that example as we go. But for now, we can move on to discuss the data elements related to funding sources. So again, like Sydney mentioned earlier, these data elements are particularly critical for AB 977 because they allow projects that are being funded by state funding sources to be identified, and that data from those projects can be attributed to state programs by dashboards and data reporting. So essentially, these codes are how you and the program that you are a grantee of receive credit for the services that you provide. Funding source data elements include funding source and other funder code, grant ID, and grant start and end date. And we will begin by talking about funding sources and other funder codes. So these are the fields that directly are used to identify that your project is receiving Homekey Plus funding. Depending on your HMIS implementation, it might be your HMIS lead doing this level of project setup for you, or you might be doing it directly. But either way, it's very important to understand what correct setup looks like. So here's a screenshot that's very fuzzy and low quality, and your implementation may look different than this, but there will be a data element called funding source. That should be set to local or other funding source, which will bring up the option to set the other funder field, which is where you should enter the other funder code that's shown on screen, CA-HCD-Homekey Plus with the plus spelled out. So this is the code to input into that other funder field to ensure that your project will be attributed to Homekey Plus. And another important aspect of funding source records to mention here is that projects should have a funding record for each program that they receive funding from. So if your project is braiding funding from different sources, there should be a funding record for each of those sources. and we'll talk through a couple of examples of how that looks in HMIS. Before we get to that, though, we'll talk about the grant ID, grant start date, and grant end date. The grant ID is a unique identifier that identifies your specific Homekey Plus grant and you as the grantee. So this ID is how we can identify which projects your specific grant is funding. The specified format of the Homekey Plus grant ID is your HCD contract number with a county code at the end. And those county codes are specified in the project setup instructions, which are in the reference slide at the end of the presentation. And we can make sure to point those out. Each funding record, similar to project operating start and end date, has a grant start and end date, which indicates the dates that a project was funded by that specific funding source. So like operating end date, the grant end date can be left blank until the project is no longer funded by that grant. And here is a zoom in on that grant ID format. So on the left, we have the Homekey Plus contract number, a dash, and then that 3-digit county code in red on the right. So now we will talk through a couple of examples of projects with multiple funding sources and how those should look in HMIS. So starting simply, here's an example of a permanent supportive housing project that is using both a Homekey Plus grant and a Homekey grant. So both grants began on July 1st and are still active at the time of data entry. So since there are two different funding sources here, that means that this project will need a funding record added for each of these programs. And we can take a look down at this table to see what the information entered for each of those funding sources should look like. On the left, there's the Homekey Plus grant with the correct other funder code and grant ID. And on the right is the Homekey grant. Since both of these sources started funding this project on July 1st, they both have a July 1st grant start date. And since they are both actively funding the project, they both have blank grant end dates. So hopefully that is clearly showing how multiple funding sources should look. We're going to get a little bit more complicated and combine that example that we just talked about with the previous project type conversion example. So now we'll be combining, So now we're going to see a project opened in HMIS, a new project started, and then multiple funding records added. And as a reminder, please don't panic if you're not following every detail of these examples exactly perfectly. This training is being recorded and will be available for your reference in the future. So in this example, a grantee received a Homekey grant to operate a transitional housing or TH project. Later, the grantee received a Homekey Plus grant to convert the housing units to permanent supportive housing or PSH. The project continues to use funds from both grants in the PSH project at the time of data entry. So looking at the table on the bottom here, this shows what the funding records will look like with the orange labeled column here representing the original TH project and these two on the right representing the funding records in the new PSH project. So we can see, notice that the Homekey records both have the same other funder code and grant ID entered since they are the same grant, and that we have two records, one for the Homekey grant and one for the Homekey Plus grant in that new PSH project. Here is a diagram that visualizes what's going on here and might make things a little bit simpler to see. So in the closed project, which is transitional housing in orange on the left, we have one Homekey funding record with a grant end date, the same as the transitional housing operating end date, since that would be the last day that that grant funded services in that project. In the new PSH project, which is active, we have two funding records, the Homekey funding record and the Homekey Plus funding record, which are both have a grant start date that is the same as the permanent supportive housing operating start date. And since this is an active project, both of those grant end dates are blank. So a lot going on there, but hopefully that is starting to sink in. The good news is that we have arrived at our break. So we can take a quick 5-minute break and come back in around 10:36 as I have it. Anything else to add before we head to break, Sydney, or anyone else? All right, we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. So I'm going to try to address a couple of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat. Let me get my notes here. So I see two questions, and we can also provide written answers in addition to this verbal answer that I'm about to provide. But for the questions from Brianna and Jonathan, we have a question from Brianna that says, so you're changing the project type for TH to PSH, and Jonathan is asking, are projects required to be converted from one project type to another project type? Wouldn't it be easier to just stop the previous project type and begin a new project type based on their respective project types? So just to be clear, that is what's going on here. So I think the confusion is perhaps in the language that we're using here, project type conversion. We're not really in HMIS doing any conversion of the project types. We're really just closing one project that is one project type and opening a new project type or a new project that is the new project type. So as far as the data in HMIS is concerned, there is really no conversion. It's just closing one project that represents one type of services and opening a new one representing a new types of services. The conversion would be, on the services that are being provided are being converted from one type of services to another. So hopefully that provides a little bit of clarity there.
And I see we have someone, it looks like, with their hand raised. I can unmute Elizabeth if you had a clarifying question on this. Otherwise, I can you. Okay, maybe that was a mistake. We can keep going.
Okay. So let me grab my talking points here. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. We are going to kick off the second half of this training by discussing the bed and unit inventory data elements. So bed and unit inventories capture a project's housing capacity on a typical night, including the total numbers of beds and units and beds dedicated to specific subpopulations. To define the terms that we're using here, in general, a bed has the capacity to serve one person while a unit may include multiple beds and serves one household in any configuration. So on the left, we have an example of different examples of what a household can look like. So that could be one parent and one child, two adults. It could just be one single person or any combination thereof. So a unit houses a household, which, since it can be multiple configurations, can consist of one or more beds. And we will talk through a couple of examples that demonstrate what this looks like. So reporting for these counts can vary a bit by project. In some cases, projects have a fixed number of units and beds, which is easy. In that case, you can see in the table down here, you should just report the fixed number of units and beds in your project. A little bit more complicated is if you have a fixed number of units, but not of beds. So this would be, for example, if you have the number of beds in a unit can vary by the number of people in the household. So if this is the case, then you should report the fixed number of units and estimate the number of beds based on the average household size. So for example, a project with 30 family units and an average family size of 3 would record 90 beds. And obviously that average household size is not always going to be nice and even, but you can just round to the nearest whole number for your final bed count. A dedicated bed inventory, the dedicated bed inventory. This is a series of data elements that specify the number of beds that are reserved in your project for subpopulations like veterans, youth, people experiencing chronic homelessness, and combinations of those groups. Note the household rule at the bottom here, which is that if one member of a household qualifies for the subpopulation, then all beds used by that household will be counted in that subpopulation, in the dedicated beds for that subpopulation. So these inventories are reported disaggregated both by our population categories that we just talked about and by household type. So when you're entering these counts for each of these subpopulation categories, you will specify the number of beds that are being served for each of these household types. And we will talk through an example of that right now. So here is our example that we're going to do some inventory reporting for. This is a project that provides housing to veterans and their families with a fixed number of apartments. So we have 10 apartments, and at least 4 of those units are required to serve chronically homeless veterans. Of those 4 units that serve chronically homeless veterans, all were serving veterans who were single with no children, so average household size of 1. And the other 6 units served other veterans who were single with 1 child, meaning that there was an average household size of 2. So I'm going to go through this inventory table starting from the bottom and work my way up through each of these counts. So for this project in particular, for dedicated beds for any other veterans, we have 12 because we had 6 units with an average household size of 2. So 2 beds per unit gives us 12 in the adults with children category, since these were all veterans who were single with 1 child. So adults with children and average household size of 2 would be 12. Moving to the chronically homeless veterans category, we had 4 units that were serving chronically homeless veterans, and all of those individuals were single. So that's going to be 4 beds in the adults without children category. Next, we have total beds. which is just going to be each of our household type categories summed for our previous category, or for our subpopulations, excuse me. So we're going to have 12 in adults with children, since we had 12 in that column for any veterans, and then 4 in adults without children. And since the total units category, the breakdown was 6 for any other veterans and 4 for chronically homeless veterans. And those breakdowns were by household type. So we had 6 units that were serving adults with children and 4 that were serving adults without children. That's how those are going to get entered there. So again, these are a little complicated, and no worries if that is not tracking perfectly. Please feel free to reference this recording in the future. And now I will pass to Sydney to discuss entering client data.
Thank you. I will be providing a short overview of client level data that gets entered into HMIS. This is not going to cover all of the data fields or everything you need to know. The designated HMIS users for your project will receive a more detailed training from their COC, HMIS leads, as well as other resources before they begin collecting client data. And so this is just intended as a high-level orientation on the type of information that gets collected in HMIS. To the next slide. All clients in Homekey Plus properties should be entered into HMIS. So that means both adults and children in the household. So it's not, the household will get configured together as a household, and then there'll be records for each person. A client always has the right to privacy and can refuse to provide their information without being denied services, and each COC will have their own privacy policies that can be referenced as well. If clients already have profiles in HMIS, maybe they were served through an emergency shelter before the permanent housing or through coordinated entry, the provider can begin with that record and verify its accuracy. That will avoid creating duplicative records, and it will be easier to just look that the information is correct versus having to enter each item separately. The client level data elements, you might hear terms universal data elements or common data elements. Those are referenced from the HMIS data standards and have to do with like which clients the data is collected for. So just want to make sure that those terms don't throw you off, but not something you need to worry too much about. The type of data elements in HMIS include things like personal identifiers, such as name or date of birth, that are used to identify clients. Demographic information, so that might be something like race and ethnicity, veteran status, or whether someone has a disabling condition. And then fields pertaining to the services received, so maybe the date the client's moving into housing, their prior living situation before moving into the Homekey Plus property. The data fields in HMIS, such as disability status or income, are self-reported by clients and do not require documentation for verification. You may be collecting that documentation for Homekey Plus requirements or for other requirements you have in operating your projects, but for HMIS specifically, it would be what the client themselves reported. Data elements will be collected and updated at different points in time, such as when the project starts or when the event occurs or at project exit, and we'll give a few examples of that. Some data elements are only required for certain project types or populations, so we'll also provide some examples of that just so you understand what we're talking about, but don't expect from this that you would know when each data element gets collected, what it's called, all of those things. On to the next slide. So here are some examples of when different data elements are or are not collected. So for example, Homekey Plus projects, many serve veterans. The veteran status field is required for adults. It is not required for children because they would be too young to be a veteran, and it's collected for all project types. The housing move-in date field is required for heads of households in permanent housing projects. So all of the Homekey Plus projects that are PSH would have a move-in date entered for the head of household. If you were previously operating as transitional housing or a shelter, that field would not have been required. And then an example of a data field that would not be required for Homekey Plus projects is the current living situation. That's required for street outreach and other types of projects, but it's not a field for PSH projects. In the setup instructions, HCD provided Appendix B has a table that has the required data elements and which populations and project types that they apply to and their when they're collected. And some HMIS systems may be pre-configured to only request required data elements. So you may not even see some of these pop up if they're not relevant to your project. And this is a place HMIS leads can answer questions as well. The state's requirements should align with the continuum of care and the federal HUD requirements. And so that's just what is shared in this appendix of the setup instructions. Great. And then talk about a few more date fields. I know Emery already went through some tied to the project, and this is a place that there is a lot of confusion. So I'll talk through, define each of these, and then we'll have a visual example that's hopefully also helpful. Entering the key dates correctly is really important to ensuring program outcomes are accurately tracked by HCD and Cal ICH, which is why we're focusing so much on them today. The project start date is when the client started receiving services and housing from the project. That can be before the client moves in. So if you are working with a client towards moving in for a few weeks before, it is okay to enroll them at that time. They just need to have been determined that they are eligible to move into the property. They've said they want to live there and that there's an opening now or in a reasonably short amount of time. So you can, the project start date can be before the move-in date. The move-in date would be the day the person actually started living in the Homekey Plus property. And then the exit date is when someone moved out of the property. If you were working with someone, they were going to move in for some reason, maybe they moved into a different PSH project or didn't move into the Homekey Plus project, they should be exited. And if they never moved in, then there would never have been a move-in date. So we would only see the project start date and exit date. And then all of these client-related dates must be within when the project is said to be operating, with those operating start and end dates. And then we can go on to the next slide with the visual. So the lighter blue line here shows the project dates, which is when the project is said to have started operating and then when it ends operations. And then the darker blue line shows project related or the client related dates. So when they moved into the project, the move-in date, the exit date. So you'll see here the project start date when client moved in is after the operating start date. So that's an accurate way to enter the data. It would also be okay if it was on the same date. So if you have a bunch of clients moving in the first day your project is operating, then you would have the operating start date and project start date the same time. The housing move-in date here is after the project start date. So that would indicate working with the client before they moved in. It is okay if the move-in date is the same as the project start date, but the move-in cannot be before the start date. So we expect to see a housing move-in date before or on the project start date. And that move-in date is really critical. That's when we considered someone's experience of homelessness to have ended by moving into permanent housing. And then you'll see the exit date is before the operating end date. It can also be on the operating end date. So if a project closes, all clients would get exited at that time. And the operating end date, I think this was shown in the other example, but I see some questions about it and we can come back to this. It can be left null. So probably these projects won't generally have an end date. And so that you don't have to enter an end date. On to the next slide. Okay, and then this is back to our example of a Homekey transitional housing project that has now received Homekey Plus funding to become a permanent housing project. The exact circumstances of how this would get set up could be project specific. And so if your project fits into this category, then please work with your HMIS lead to ensure the proper transition of clients in this circumstance. But this is just a general example. And I'm not going to go into every word on the slide here, but we did want that for reference when you're looking at the slides or the recording, and to provide a high level example. So here we have the Homekey Transitional Housing Project operating from January through November, and then a PSH project coming online in July. The operating dates should capture the range of time that the project was operating with anyone residing in transitional housing and anyone residing in permanent supportive housing. If you're doing kind of a phased transition, then these can overlap. So if some clients are still in transitional housing and other are in permanent housing, it is okay to have two projects with overlapping dates. An example of that might be, let's say you have a 2-story building, one floor is converting to from transitional to permanent first, and then the other floor. And so you might have two projects going on at the same time. The project operating end date of the transitional housing project will be whenever the last client moves out. So as long as one client is still in transitional housing, then that should remain an open project. And then the new project, the Homekey Plus PSH project, should be open or have an operating start date. That's before or on when the first client moves in to PSH. The client you'll see in this example lived in the transitional housing project from May until September. And then on September 1st, they were exited from TH, and then they moved into the permanent housing project on that same date. So you'll see that here. And then their move-in date was September 1st. The move-in date will be when they moved into permanent supportive housing, not when they first moved into the project. Move-in date is not a field for transitional housing projects, so that's why it says not collected here. And then just wanted to wrap up with some next steps, and then I see we have quite a few questions in the Q&A box, so we'll take those after this live. And please do, if you have questions, and start entering them now if you haven't already. So we will, the biggest next step, which will depend on when your project starts operating, will be connecting with your HMIS lead. As we said previously, we recommend doing that at least 90 days before operations begin. So for projects that might be coming online in fall, reaching out sometime this summer, using the contact list provided, you would share information with your HMIS lead. You can use the template I mentioned, that's Appendix A of the setup instructions, to provide key information, or your COC may provide their own template, and you are responsible for providing them with the correct information. But obviously, if you have questions, they can assist in that process, and then they will provide access to any trainings. And then on to the next slide. These will be sent out or posted to HCD's website or Cal ICH's website, depending on the resource after, but just wanted to highlight what is available for you all. So the HMIS setup instructions are already on HCD's website and were sent out. Those really have all the information we covered today, and things like how to know what your funding codes are, project types, all of that. So that's really the key document. There is an FAQ document that currently, this is the first time we're receiving Homekey Plus questions, so it doesn't include Homekey Plus questions yet. We'll be updating it with questions we received today, but it still may be helpful. It has questions from Homekey grantees and the other HCD programs. And then on Cal ICH's website, there are 3 recorded webinars: HMIS 101, trauma-informed data collection training and HMIS data quality best practices that you can also access. And then we'll be sending out the HMIS lead contact list as well. I believe that was sent out prior to this. And then their email address for HCD is on the slide for where to reach out with AB 977 questions. And then I saw a few questions in the chat about where this recording and slides will get posted. And Stephanie said that would be on HCD's website. But Stephanie, if you have a specific URL where that would be, feel free to share that or put it in the chat.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I did, in the chat, I included the Homekey email address, and I included a link to our website. So once the presentation is posted, we will make sure we send an email out to each and every one of you, noting that it is now available for viewing, and we will also include the slides, and hopefully we can compile the list into an FAQ so that you have all the information here for your reference.
And then one question I see that might be best answered by you, Stephanie, is there's a question of when are Homekey Plus programs starting? So when the funding is out to start getting these projects in HMIS. My understanding is funding has already gone out for at least some projects, and they could be starting as early as this fall, but anything you want to add there?
Yes, thank you, Sydney. I did see the question, and yes, the programs are already being funded. What you can do is you can visit our website. We do have a list of all of the awarded projects available for your reference, and as soon as the standard agreements are approved and executed, that's when the funding will initially be issued. But that's done through our sister department, SGM and MGM. So I think it just depended on when the contracts are executed is when the funding is released. But if you are curious and wonder if the projects that you're associated with or affiliated with have been funded, please visit our website under the awardee list and get the information that you need there. And again, if you have any other questions regarding Homekey, please reach out via our email, and we'll be happy to assist you.
And the data entry requirements starting is based on when clients are being served, not when the funding was received. So if there's a project that has received funding, but no one is living in that property, there would be no data to enter into HMIS. So I know that's a question we get sometimes. NHCD has other, reporting requirements, but for the 977 data entry requirements, there's only data to enter when people are either moved in or about to move into the projects. And so that's the time frame where we would start looking at if the data is entered. And we can start running through the questions. I see a couple about operating end dates and whether they can be null or have an end date that indicates null. I think there's an example here of 12/31/9999. So the end dates can be null, and your HMIS lead may have a specific date they use for that or protocol, but we would not expect to see an operating end date on projects that are going to be operating for many years.
Yeah, so just to add into that, I think those, it would be very reasonable for both of those questions to have null operating end dates and grant end dates. I would just want to flag it may not be recommended to use a placeholder date like that 999 example that you had, just because that there's a chance that might get flagged as an error on our end for having a year that is unreasonable. So in that case, I would just recommend to leave that grant end date blank.
And then there's another question about if a project stops serving clients on January 1st has an end date entered and then start serving clients 6 months later, whether the practice would be to delete the project end date as if it were a continuous project, or the alternative would be setting up a new project and this may have been about the project type conversion. If it's operating as a new project type, like it's closed transitional housing and now it's permanent supportive housing, it would make the most sense probably to have a new project. So the old one would keep its end date, and then the new one would have a separate set of dates. If it's the same, if it was PSH and then it continues to be PSH and there's just a 6 month gap, that might be at the HMIS lead's discretion in terms of how that makes the most sense to set up. I don't know if you've seen that before, Emery.
I don't I may have seen the result of that before, but I haven't ever discussed how to deal with that specific situation. I would think that it would in general be a little bit cleaner to start a new project. I don't think there would like necessarily be any adverse impacts to um, just deleting that project end date, assuming that all clients were exited at the time of the original project end date. But with the project end date deleted and then that project reopened, we would have the case where the data reflects the project being open for that entire time when it wasn't. So it seems more accurate to start a new project in that case. But again, yeah, that might be um, something to consult with your HMIS lead about.
And then there's several questions about braided funding. So we can try and address some of those, but those will be project specific dependent on what funding is being braided. Like we can speak to braiding of different state funding sometimes, but if you're talking about braiding like HUD and state funding, that would be a good conversation to have with your HMIS lead, and they can certainly reach out to CalICH if there's uncertainty, but just we cannot advise on things that would impact federal reporting. And so that would be a case by case basis. We will say generally we would advise having multiple funding codes set up over having duplicative projects. That's almost always easier for data entry, keeping things easier and cleaner in HMIS. So for the only reasons where you might need to set up separate funding is if there are clients that, let's say, are only considered served by one program and not the other, or wouldn't be eligible for the other program, then you may need to set up either separate out the clients and one project has both funders and one only has one funder, or explore other options. But let's say I'll just take a state funded example. Let's say your Homekey Plus project was funded by HCD for the construction, and then you are using HAP 5 funds, let's say, for operations. In that situation, our recommendation would be a single project where there's one set of funding codes for Homekey Plus and one set for HAP 5, and that you're not setting up two separate projects. And then there's also, I think, similarly on handling beds and bed inventory when there's different subsidies, paying for those projects. If they can be set up as one project, then there would be no issues with duplicative inventory. And so that would be the ideal situation. But if there's some reason that can't be the case, there may be a need to have clients enrolled in different projects, or to think through that more.
I'll just add for the question from Salam. Hi, nice to talk with you again. I think we were talking a couple of weeks ago. But I think we might want to follow up with you on the specific scenario that you're describing here. Um, I am not sure I'm aware of a situation where HMIS does not allow overlapping grant records with the same amount. So we might just follow up to get a little bit more information on the scenario there. From from what I'm reading what in your question here, um, it sounds to me like this should be a case where there's one funding record for the local grant ID and one for the state grant ID. So if that is not able to happen in your HMIS, we might want to understand a little bit better what's going on there.
And if your local system specifically has like a primary and a secondary, I don't think that should impact anything on our side as long as they're all coming through in the export, but we could check on that. We're looking at just if it's one of the codes, not if it's the first one or anything like that. I think we have some HMIS leads on the call because I see some familiar names from our HDIS Connect session. So generally, our practice here is, grantees would reach out to HMIS leads about setup in questions. Probably 90+% of the questions you have are very standard things your HMIS leads deal with all the time and will know how to set up the project. And then if there are very unique or complex circumstances, which certainly do arise, then the HMIS leads all have Cal ICH's contact information. And so then they would reach out to us and we can have that more technical discussion about what the different options are and loop in HCD as needed. So for grantees on the call, the first step would be your HMIS lead. If there are HMIS leads on the call and you're getting things from state grantees that are really complicated and you want to talk through those, then please do reach out to Cal ICH.
I'm seeing this most recent question around a central list of grant IDs or contract IDs. So, as far as I know, that is not information that is published publicly or distributed by HCD, but I think that is a question for Stephanie to confirm whether or not there's a comprehensive list of contract IDs that would be available to grantee or to HMIS leads to refer to.
Yes, I will look into this and provide a response a bit later. But thank you.
And when we, when HCD and Cal ICH are reaching out to grantees because we're not finding the right project in HMIS, our ask is for the grantee who should know their contract number to provide that to the HMIS lead. So obviously, both parties having that is helpful. The expectation in terms of providing the correct numbers would be on the Homekey Plus grantee. And if a Homekey Plus grantee does not know their contract number, then they could reach out to HCD. I would think that generally grantees would know their contract number, and so it might be a place where the service provider needs to check in with the recipient of the funding. We do have a standard list of the other funder codes since those are just at the program level for all of the HMIS leads. That's on Cal ICH's AB 977 webpage, so that will have kind of the structure for every single state funded program, but the contract numbers still have to get inserted. So it would show you like what you would be looking for, but not each grantee's contract number. It did sound like the awardees from Stephanie, what you said, are on HCD's website, so you can look at which awardees you might be expecting to see within your geography, but that doesn't have the contract number that would have other project information.
I see the question from Teresa on grant start and end dates for funding that is used for construction or one-time capital funding. This is a great question. So in this case, the grant is going to be set up on to begin on the first day that the project begins serving clients, and can just be left blank, because it can be considered to be funding the duration of the project. So it doesn't need to be entered when the construction is happening. It can still remain focused on when clients are being served.
And it's not an issue if the operating date, start date indicated before clients were served. It's just there's no need for the project to be shown as operating in that time, but that won't like flag an error. We can just give it another minute or two in case any more questions pop up. I believe we answered all of the questions, but if anything was missed or needs further clarification, feel free to resubmit your question.
I did see something from Sandra Fernandez who stated that when she clicked on the link provided, it says the web page is moved. I clicked on the link myself several different times and it takes you directly to the website. So I'm not sure maybe we need to clear your browser or the cache. But in any event, I'll repost just so that you know.
I think that I'm not seeing anything else pop in. So appreciate everyone for attending today. If questions arise, we shared HCD's contact info, and then if HCD will work with Cal ICH to provide answers, and we will review the questions asked today. And if any were not covered in our setup in the current FAQs that we have for the other HCD programs, we will add those, and then HCD and Cal ICH will work to send out the resources mentioned today. And if HMIS leads on the call have any questions for Cal ICH, please reach out to us directly.
So it looks like we don't have any further questions, and we'll conclude our training. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and we look forward to working with you all. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.